All right, let's jump straight into this explainer because we're tackling a massive headache that basically every engineering team on the planet deals with. We're going to look at exactly why our old school methods of hoarding and sharing knowledge are just totally failing us, and more importantly, how we can actually build an architecture of living documentation. So picture this. It's your first week on a new team. You're fired up, you're ready to dive in and write some code. But then, out of nowhere, someone taps you on the shoulder and asks you to look into a failing service on a server in production. Naturally, you ask the most logical question anyone in that situation would ask. Okay, where are the docs? And crickets. You get this long, incredibly uncomfortable pause. Finally, someone chimes in with, well, there's got to be something in Confluence. You know, a guy named Marcus handled most of that. But here's the kicker. Marcus left 8 months ago. So you open up the company wiki, and they're just staring at this 600-page absolute monolith of a document that hasn't been touched since 2022. You search the service name, get 12 different results, read through every single one of them, and absolutely none of them match what's actually running in production right now. Defeated, you go back to your coworker, who just shrugs and drops a link to some random, completely out-of-context Slack thread from 3 years ago. Congratulations, you've just inherited the absolute most dangerous form of documentation. Now, listen, this really isn't a story about lazy engineers. Most of us desperately want to write good docs. It's actually a story about fundamentally broken systems. Which brings us to the first major issue, the tribal knowledge trap, or as it's often called, inheriting the unwritten. Tribal knowledge is quite literally a single point of failure wearing a human face. It is easily the most common documentation system in the world, and honestly, it works perfectly. Right up until Dave goes on vacation, gets sick, or, leaves the company for a new job. The highly uncomfortable truth here is that teams usually don't realize just how much they're running entirely on Dave's brain until he's gone. And unfortunately, that's a fact they usually discover at 2 a.m. during a massive system outage. And if relying on one person's memory is a terrible idea, let's look at the documentation graveyards, where good intentions go to die. So the alternative most teams instinctively reach for is a centralized wiki. Confluence, Notion, SharePoint, whatever. It sounds fantastic in theory, right? Everyone just goes to one central place. But in practice, wikis accumulate pages the exact same way addicts accumulate junk. Nobody ever deletes anything. Why? Because everyone is absolutely terrified of being the person who deletes that one obscure page that actually turns out to be mission critical. The real problem with wikis is that they're fundamentally disconnected from the actual work. You ship a change to your infrastructure, you move on to the next ticket, and the wiki quietly sits there describing a world that doesn't exist anymore. Fast forward 6 months, and it's a well-intentioned but completely unreliable museum. Docs' code, on the other hand, fixes this by integrating directly into the engineering workflow. It lives right next to the code, so it actually holds up accurately over time. So let's talk about why Docs as code works so well, which is essentially just putting Markdown straight into the repo. To close this massive knowledge gap, we have to bring the documentation to exactly where the engineers already spend their day. There are 3 big pillars that make this approach survive. First off, the docs are right next to the thing they describe. If you're reading a Kubernetes config, the plain Markdown runbook is sitting right there in the exact same directory. Second, updates happen completely naturally during pull request reviews. The same eyes catching code bugs or catching outdated docs. Someone can just say, hey, wait, this runbook still references that old load balancer we migrated back in January. It's a natural conversation. And third, the Git history instantly tells you if you should be suspicious. If you open a runbook and see the last commit was from 3 years ago, that's a glaring, visible red flag that it might be totally stale. Now we can take this a step further with the auto-generation advantage. This is when the docs literally are the system. By building on that Docs as code foundation, we can actually reach the holy grail of engineering workflows, eliminating the manual writing step entirely. With tools like Terraform Docs reading your module variables or Open API specs generating interactive API documentation on the fly, the documentation absolutely cannot drift from reality. Why? Because it regenerates automatically the second the code changes. There's literally no manual step for someone to skip or forget. In this setup, the docs don't just describe the system, they are the system. Okay, so how do we put this into practice? Let's talk about building living documentation using a realistic hybrid approach. Now that we have these powerful tools at our disposal, we can piece them together into a realistic blueprint. Because let's be real, the best teams don't just pick one rigid approach for everything. They build a hybrid stack. You want to keep your operational runbooks, service readmes, and architecture decision records in docs as code. That's the stuff engineers write and own. Next, let your tooling auto-generate your APIs and infrastructure components wherever you possibly can. And finally, keep that lightweight wiki, but reserve it strictly for genuinely non-technical content, things like company-wide reference material and onboarding guides that non-engineers actually need to maintain. If you take absolutely nothing else away from this explainer today, please let it be this golden rule. Keep your docs as close to the source of truth as humanly possible. It's basically a fundamental law of engineering that the further your documentation lives from the thing it actually describes, the faster it goes stale. Proximity is accuracy. And to keep those docs alive, to truly maintain that living architecture we're talking about, they can never, ever be relegated to a separate backlog ticket. The teams that actually succeed at this make documentation an unbreakable part of their definition of done. It has to be part of the pull request, it has to be part of the peer review, and it has to be part of the actual shipping process. Because, as we all know far too well from our own painful experiences, "we'll document it later" is literally one of the most expensive sentences in tech. Later almost never comes. You get busy, the priorities shift, and suddenly that delayed documentation has snowballed into a massive, crippling mountain of technical debt that slows your entire team to a crawl. So I want you to take a hard look at your own repositories today. Look at your team's workflow and ask yourself one final question. Is your documentation truly living, embedded right in the code, and regenerating with every change? Or are you just holding your breath, operating on borrowed time, and waiting for Dave to go on vacation? Consider making living documentation an unbreakable part of your definition of done starting today.